don't come. Tonight's party is only for the elites. The appearance of a filthy soldier with PTSD like you will destroy the family's reputation. That was the cruel banishment message from my own parents glaring right at my eyes. Before I could even lock the screen, my sister Vivien video called her voice, hissing through gritted teeth. Remember your place, Emily. Don't drag that delusional face here to humiliate the Raya's family. In the background, the mocking sneer of her socialite rival echoed. Oh, is the psycho little sister banned? I looked down at the jagged scar on my forearm, a mark from my last deployment overseas, heartlessly branded as insanity by my own mother. With a slight smirk, I calmly pressed the disconnect button. They banned this filthy soldier to protect their fake upper-class facade. 2 hours later, the most powerful 4-star general in America would walk right into the center of that banquet hall, look my mother dead in the eye, and coldly growl, "Where is my major?" Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, the venomous text still burning in my retinas. But instead of anger, my nostrils suddenly filled with the sharp, metallic tang of titanium dust and curing concrete. That specific gritty scent snapped my memory back 3 years to the crumbling ruins of Fort Aegis. I had spent 6 agonizing months out there deployed by the Department of Defense, living in a command tent while leading a $12 million classified renovation project. I wore fatigues caked in mud machine oil, and my own blood from a jagged piece of rebar that had slashed my left shoulder during a structural collapse in the East Wing. The medic stitched me up under a portable lamp, and I was back commanding the perimeter before sunrise. I personally reviewed the structural load calculations for every single reinforced panel and blast-rated hinge in that installation. I stood on the catwalks monitoring airflow resistance. I inspected the flooded subbase, overseeing the drainage tests while my squad pumped water around the clock. Around me, Captain Miller and a squad of military engineers moved with synchronized, unspoken respect. These men and women did not ask about my family name. They asked if the load-bearing calculations checked out, if the titanium alloy would hold under duress, if the wiring met spec. When Miller handed me a heavy steel wrench one scorching afternoon, his eyes held a profound, unwavering loyalty. It was a look of pure validation, a look my own bloodline, obsessed with country clubs and stock portfolios, had never once given to me in my entire 32 years of existence. The memory of Miller's respect immediately collided with a darker, suffocating flashback from 6 years ago. I was standing perfectly still on the freezing marble floor of our family estate's living room. My father, Richard, stormed across the Persian rug, his face twisted in aristocratic fury. Without a word of greeting, he violently hurled a leather-bound contract directly at my chest. It was a dummy vice president position for the Reyes Corporation, a golden leash meant to buy my absolute obedience. When I let the thick stack of papers hit the floor, refusing to be a decorative puppet in his corporate empire, all the oxygen vanished from the room. My Aunt Patricia was standing rigidly by the mahogany bar, clutching her pearl necklace. She saw my father's unhinged rage, but her eyes darted nervously to her expensive shoes. Her instinct was pure financial cowardice. She knew I was right, but she depended on my father's trust fund to survive. Rather than defend her own niece, Patricia took a pathetic step backward, physically aligning herself with the abuser to protect her allowance. That single step told me everything I needed to know about the woman's spine. It was made of jelly and dollar bills. My father stepped aggressively into my personal space, the suffocating heavy scent of his Cuban cigars invading my lungs. His rage was not born from parental concern for my safety in the military. It was born from a deep tyrannical insecurity. I was the only asset in his entire life that his checkbook could not control. His snorts had bought Patricia's silence. He had bought Vivien's loyalty. He had bought Arthur Vance's servitude. He owned every person in that room except me, and that made me his greatest threat. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with capitalistic disgust, reducing my military uniform to rags. "When will a filthy soldier ever amount to anything?" he hissed, jabbing his manicured finger inches from my face. "You are a disgrace to the Ria's name." He delivered the words with the calculated intent to break my spirit. Vivien, sitting on the sofa, let out a soft, satisfied giggle, soaking up my degradation to temporarily soothe her own crippling lack of achievements. She crossed her legs, smoothing the fabric of a dress that cost more than a junior enlisted soldier's monthly pay, and tilted her champagne glass toward me in a mock toast. Diane stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, watching the scene with the cold approval of a woman who had already decided which daughter was worth keeping. Nobody in that room intervened. Nobody suggested he lower his voice or apologize. The silence was unanimous, rehearsed, and absolutely damning. I did not flinch. I just stared into my father's eyes, realizing he was nothing more than a terrified banker wearing a father's mask. His insecurity was not about my career choice. It was about the fact that I proved a person could build a life entirely outside his financial empire. I existed as living proof that his money was not the center of the universe, and that truth ate him alive. The memory dissolved, bringing me back to the present inside my tactical command center. I traced the cold edge of my steel desk, a dark smirk forming on my lips. The multi-layered irony tasted like ash. Tonight, Richard Reyes was spending millions of dollars to host his elite anniversary gala at Fort Aegis. My parents were arrogantly parading their wealth on floors I had reinforced, protected by walls I had engineered. They were eagerly paying a fortune for the illusion of safety, completely oblivious that they were breathing inside a masterpiece built by the exact filthy soldier they had just crew banned. They measured power by the price of their champagne, while my power lay in the titanium panel securing their miserable lives. I did not waste a single second feeling sorry for myself. I turned to my secure terminal, aggressively typing in my clearance codes, and filed my logistics report. Let them play their pathetic social games. The structure keeping the ceiling above their ungrateful heads had my sweat in its foundation. My personal civilian phone buzzed, vibrating harshly against the metal desk. It was a new text message from Aunt Patricia, dripping with a sickening manufactured concern designed to gaslight me from afar. "Emily, are you having a trauma episode lately? Your mother is very worried about your condition." I did not type a reply. I did not even blink. Instead, the phantom sting of my old forearm wound flared up, ripping my consciousness straight back to last year's freezing Christmas Eve. I had just returned stateside from a brutal classified deployment in the Middle East. I walked through the heavy oak doors of our family mansion, my service boots tracking snow onto the pristine foyer. Underneath the sleeve of my dress shirt, a fresh, thick medical bandage wrapped tightly around a jagged graze on my forearm. The wound was still throbbing, a raw testament to a mission that kept American civilians sleep safely in their beds. I stepped into the dazzling, music-filled living room, completely exhausted, but hoping for a sliver of familial warmth. I had been awake for 36 hours straight, running final extraction logistics before my flight home. My mother, Diane, turned around and instantly froze. She did not rush forward to embrace me. She did not ask if I was in pain. She did not say, "Welcome home," or "Merry Christmas," or even, "Sit down." Her eyes locked onto the edge of the bloody bandage peeking out from my cuff with absolute unadulterated revulsion. She looked at me as if I had dragged a filthy infectious disease onto her imported Persian rug. A prominent surgeon standing near the piano noticed my bandage and took a step toward me, genuine medical concern on his face. Diane intercepted him with a sharp hand on his elbow and a whispered redirect, physically steering him away from me before he could ask what happened. Diane's entire social existence was built on the illusion of biological perfection. Having a daughter who engaged in violent bloody service overseas shattered her curated country club aesthetic. A daughter with scars did not photograph well next to the Hermes bags and charity brunch selfies. A daughter who bled for her country reminded people that the world was ugly, and ugly had no place in Diane's living room. Across the room, Vivien paused midway through sipping her expensive champagne, her eyes widening in feigned shock before her lips curled into a toxic, knowing smirk. She leaned toward her friend, whispering something behind her manicured hand, and both women glanced at my bandaged arm and suppressed a laugh. Vivien fed off my mother's disgust, using my alienation as fuel to secure her position as the flawless, untainted golden child. She did not have to do anything impressive. She just had to make sure I looked worse. The room fell silent as the elite guests noticed Diane's horror. Instead of acknowledging my military service, Diane spun around to face her wealthy friends. She plastered a perfectly rehearsed, sorrowful smile across her heavily Botoxed face. "Emily is not doing well lately," she lied, her voice dripping with fake theatrical maternal martyrdom. "She has severe PTSD from the war. Please understand, she is often delusional." She stared right through me as she said it. She weaponized mental illness right in front of my face to erase my honor. I stood there, a highly decorated intelligence officer, instantly reduced to a crazy daughter, so my mother would not have to explain why her child wore a military uniform instead of a designer gown. She gleefully assassinated my character to preserve her flawless dinner party. The guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing between me and Diane. Nobody challenged her. Nobody asked me if I was okay. I was the elephant in the room that the room decided to label insane rather than heroic. Their silence was the most expensive form of cowardice money could buy. I immediately looked at Aunt Patricia, who was standing right next to Diane, her knuckles white, as she clutched a crystal wine glass. Patricia knew I was perfectly sane. She had seen my deployment orders. She had once accidentally opened a piece of my classified mail and read enough to understand that I ran high-level security operations, not delusions. She knew exactly what that graze on my forearm meant. I stared directly into her eyes, silently, demanding her to speak the truth. Patricia's lips parted for a fraction of a second, as if the words might actually come. But then Richard cleared his throat from across the room, a subtle territorial sound, and Patricia's mouth snapped shut. Her deep-seated fear of poverty paralyzed her. She averted her cowardly eyes, staring intently at the ice cubes in her glass, choosing the safety of Richard's financial allowance over basic human decency. She took a slow sip, her hand trembling, and turned her back to me completely. That night, I drove back to the base in complete silence, the heater in my truck, blasting against the cold air, while the wound on my arm pulsed under the bandage. I gripped the steering wheel hard enough to turn my knuckles white, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of understanding. My mother had just publicly declared me mentally ill to protect her holiday decor. My aunt had chosen a trust fund over the truth. My sister had toasted my humiliation. I did not cry. I cataloged the betrayal, filed it in the back of my mind alongside the deployment reports, and moved on. Looking at Patricia's hypocritical text message on my phone in the present day, I felt nothing but a wave of icy absolute contempt. I hit the delete button, erasing her from my screen. A coward's silence requires no explanation, and I refused to negotiate my sanity with parasites. Just hours after Vivien and Patricia launched their coordinated psychological attacks, the atmosphere in my sector shifted abruptly. The heavy rhythmic boots of Captain Miller echoed down the sterile base corridor, accompanied by two junior intelligence officers carrying encrypted lockboxes. Miller marched directly into my office, his posture rigid with absolute military discipline. "Major Express dispatch from the Pentagon," he announced, his voice booming with official reverence. He handed me a classified Department of Defense dossier, marked with highest priority. I opened the stiff cardboard folder. Inside was a formal decree from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I was being awarded the Legion of Merit for my exceptional bravery and architectural brilliance on the Fort Aegis project. The junior officers in the room immediately snapped to attention, their eyes reflecting genuine awe, a profound respect my parents would spend millions trying to buy, but could never earn. The weight of the parchment in my hands felt heavier than any burden my family had ever placed on my shoulders. This was not purchased with a checkbook. This was earned with blood, discipline, and sacrifice. The irony was almost unbearable. Before I could even process the weight of that document, the secure red line on my desk began to flash and buzz loudly. I picked up the receiver. It was General Margaret Caldwell, the 4-star commander, who had personally approved the Aegis blueprints. Her voice was steady, vibrating with the kind of absolute uncorrupted authority my father only pretended to have in his boardrooms. "Congratulations, Emily. You absolutely deserve this honor. America owes you a thank you." She stated her words sharp and genuine. There was no hesitation, no gaslighting, no manipulative subtext, just pure unadulterated respect from a leader who understood the price of sacrifice. It was the exact emotional validation my family had violently starved me of for over 3 decades, delivered effortlessly by a woman who judged me solely on my merit. I straightened in my chair, pressing the receiver tighter against my ear, soaking in every syllable like a dying plant absorbing rain. As we wrapped up a brief intelligence review regarding base security protocols, the general casually shifted the conversation to her upcoming civilian schedule. "I'm attending a private gala tomorrow evening at Fort Aegis." She mentioned wrestling papers on her end. "It's hosted by a real estate tycoon family named Reyes. Same last name as yours, actually." She paused and I heard the warmth in her chuckle. "I hope they have half of your bravery and integrity." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, though my face remained an impassive mask. My parents had undoubtedly poured millions of dollars and pulled every corrupt string they had just to secure her attendance, desperate to use her stars to inflate Richard's stock prices. The general had absolutely no idea she was walking into a den of vipers who shared my DNA. They would smile at her, shake her hand, pour her the finest wine, and never once mention that the very installation she was standing in was designed by the daughter they had just banned and called crazy. I stood in silence for a fraction of a second. The irony was suffocating. My parents had paid a fortune to rent a building I designed and invite a general who respected me, all while telling that same general that I was mentally unstable. They were building their entire evening on my foundation, literally and figuratively, while erasing me from the guest list. I could have warned her right then and there. I could have exposed their pathetic lies and humiliated my father before the appetizers were even served. One sentence would have done it. "General, that family banned me tonight and calls me insane, but true power does not scheme, and I refuse to stoop to their level." I kept my voice perfectly level, politely, wishing the general a highly pleasant and secure evening. I hung up the phone and turned to Miller, commanding him to pull up the latest satellite surveillance files. I chose to stay on base and bury myself in my duty. I did not need to crash their pathetic party to prove my worth. Let my family drown in their own shallow, expensive illusions. I sat down, opened a classified file, and let the silence of my discipline drown out the noise of their existence. My value was not determined by their guest list. My value was etched in steel, certified by the Pentagon, and pinned with the seal of the nation. A week and 3 days before the gala, my encrypted phone buzzed, vibrating aggressively against my steel desk. It was Vivien. I answered, keeping my audio feed on a secure loop. Her voice dripped with that sickening sugary gaslighting she perfected for high society. "Emily, it's a pity you can't come," she cooed, though I could hear the frantic underlying panic in her breath. "It's full of VIPs there, and with your unstable temper, you'd ruin everything. I'm just thinking of you." Guests don't like seeing someone constantly glaring and tense like they're about to go to war. Through the video feed, I noticed Bradley standing in the background of her luxurious penthouse. He was not smiling, he was buttoning his cuff, staring at Vivien with a cold, calculating detachment, clearly exhausted by her obsessive need to tear me down. I caught him rolling his eyes the moment Vivien turned away from the camera, a flicker of disgust crossing his features before the mask of the beautiful husband snapped back into place. His body language screamed that he was already calculating exit costs. Vivien's desperate attempt to paint me as a volatile threat was a transparent shield to hide her own deep-seated terror that I might outshine her. Her weaponized words instantly triggered a memory from 16 years ago. The Winter estate was completely engulfed in roaring, suffocating flames. The smoke was so thick it turned the night sky orange, while our parents screamed helplessly on the snowy lawn, doing absolutely nothing but calling each other's names in panic. I, only 16 years old, did not wait for the fire department. I grabbed a heavy steel sledgehammer from the gardener's shed, sprinted barefoot across the frozen patio, and shattered the reinforced glass doors with 2 brutal swings. The heat hit me like a wall. The ceiling of the upstairs hallway was already collapsing, raining down burning timber. I found Vivien curled in the bathtub, paralyzed, sobbing, her arms wrapped around her knees, too frozen with fear to even stand. I hooked my arms under hers and dragged her across the tile through the hallway, over the shattered glass, and out into the snow. The glass sliced my palms to the bone. I burned my hands raw to save her life. The paramedics wrapped my bleeding fingers while Vivien sat in the back of the ambulance, unable to stop shaking, unable to even form words. Our parents rushed to Vivien first, cradling her, cooing over her, wrapping her in a cashmere blanket while I sat alone on the curb, dripping blood onto the frozen asphalt. A firefighter finally came over and handed me a rag for my hands. Snorts, nobody from my family checked on me. Nobody said thank you. Not that night, not the next morning, not ever. Instead of gratitude, my bravery became her ultimate psychological trigger. My competence in the face of death highlighted her pathetic freezing cowardice. Every time someone mentioned the fire at a family gathering, Vivien changed the subject. She needed me to be crazy intense now, so she would not have to face how utterly weak she truly was. She gaslit my vigilance because it was the only way she could maintain the illusion of being the superior, flawless, golden child. I tightened my grip on my tactical pen, refusing to let her rewrite history. 2 days later, my father called. There were no greetings, just the barking, tyrannical orders of a man used to buying submission. In the background, I could hear Diane's shrill voice urging him on, coaching him like a puppeteer yanking strings, her paranoia pushing him to neutralize me before the gala. I heard her hiss, "Be firm, Richard." She listens to authority as if I were a disobedient employee rather than their daughter. "I forbid you from lingering near the Aegis area." Richard roared, his voice cracking slightly with an unusual desperation. "General Caldwell will be there. I will not allow you to drag your filthy soldier face and those hideous scars to ruin my networking opportunity. If you show up, I will ensure your military career is finished." His threat was a masterclass in capitalist delusion. He genuinely believed his corporate lawyers and political donations could strip a decorated major of her rank. He had spent his entire life in boardrooms where money talked and people obeyed. He had never encountered a system he could not buy, and the military was that system. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had just signed my merit citation. Richard's country club connections could not touch that document with a 100-foot pole. Diane whispered fiercely in the background. "Tell her we'll cut her off completely." A hilarious threat to a woman who had been financially independent since the day she enlisted. I had not taken a single dollar from Richard Reyes since I was 18 years old. My retirement fund, my investments, my savings, all built from military pay and smart decisions. He was threatening to take away something he had never given me. The absurdity was almost theatrical. Richard thought he was a supreme commander, but listening to his frantic yelling, I realized he was just a terrified old man guarding a fragile house of cards. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend my sanity or my scars. I simply leaned back in my tactical chair, my eyes locked onto the live perimeter cameras of Fort Aegis flashing on my monitors. "I'm busy on a mission. Feel free to put on your little show." I delivered the words flat, freezing, and entirely devoid of emotion. Before he could sputter another threat, I slammed the receiver down, cutting the connection. The storm was now fully primed. My parents and Vivien were proudly, blindly marching right into the center of the exposure, completely unaware that their frantic attempts to bury me were exactly what would cement their ultimate destruction. They thought banning me was a victory. They had no idea it was the fuse. The night of the anniversary, gala arrived, bringing two entirely different worlds into a brutal collision. The echo of my father's desperate threat morphed seamlessly into the delicate clinking of crystal champagne glasses, broadcasting from my surveillance monitors. Because my intelligence unit was managing the outer security perimeter for General Caldwell, I had a high-definition front-row seat to the circus. On screen, too, Arthur Vance was sweating profusely, scurrying like a panicked, overfed rat. He frantically barked orders at the catering staff, acting as if he commanded an army merely to clear a path for Diane. My mother glided through the room, her smile painfully stretched, desperate to grovel at General Caldwell's feet. The memory of Arthur flared in my mind. He was the same man who used to lock me out of the main house when I returned from basic training, treating me like a stray dog on Diane's orders. He once left my duffel bag on the wet porch in January, then closed the curtains when I knocked. Now he was guarding a structure. I designed barking orders inside walls. I reinforced, completely oblivious to the irony soaking every inch of that building. On the same screen, I spotted Aunt Patricia near the bar, leaning into a cluster of wealthy wives. She snorts was nodding along to something Diane was saying, her hand subtly guiding a curious guest away from a family photo that still included my face. Even at the party, she was actively erasing me. The enabler's work never stopped. On camera 3, Vivien stood near a towering ice sculpture, her shimmering designer gown failing to mask her rigid posture. Bradley stood beside her, his body angled away his eyes, constantly scanning the room for better Wall Street networking targets. He was already subconsciously distancing himself from her nervous energy. Then Victoria Sterling glided into the frame like a predator, sensing blood in the water. Victoria knew Vivien's charity persona was entirely fraudulent, built on Richard's money rather than actual empathy. She had been circling Vivien for months, collecting ammunition for exactly this kind of moment. "Oh my Vivien, why do you look so tense?" Victoria purred loudly, ensuring the surrounding elites heard every word. "Keep darting your eyes like that, afraid your psycho sister will show up and ruin this fake party." Vivien's face palled instantly. She swallowed hard, her manicured fingers trembling as she gripped her glass, the heavy layers of expensive makeup completely failing to hide her sheer pathetic terror. Victoria lingered for 3 full seconds, savoring the damage, then glided away to her next target. Bradley glanced at his wife's trembling hands and looked away, not offering comfort, not steadying her arm. He reached for another glass of champagne and took a long sip, already emotionally gone. I reached out and sharply twisted the dial, cutting the audio feed from the party. In stark contrast to their suffocating, perfumed vanity, I sat in the command center, bathed in cold, unforgiving fluorescent light. I wore my full-duty fatigues, the heavy, durable fabric grounding me to reality. The air in the room smelled of black coffee and ozone from the server racks. Captain Miller sat across from me, his brow furrowed in deep concentration as he cross-referenced live threat matrices with 2 junior analysts. A fresh intelligence file had come in flagging a potential perimeter breach near the Eastern Access Road, and Miller was coordinating a drone sweep to confirm the signal origin. The pressure in our room was palpable. We were actively securing the perimeter for a 4-star general, analyzing real lethal dangers to protect national security. Meanwhile, my family was playing dress-up, experiencing stress over who wore a better gown. We were men and women of action, while the Reyes family was a collection of hollow mannequins posing for a photographer they hired with my father's dirty money. I watched Vivien stumble away from Victoria on the monitor, but I felt absolutely zero pity for her. I did not care about Victoria's petty insults or Vivien's social panic. I snorts kept my eyes locked on the tactical radar maps, double-checking the perimeter positions on the Aegis roof. My family was throwing $1 million party on the foundation of my sweat. Yet, they had actively, viciously erased my existence to protect their pride. I unholstered my sidearm, meticulously, checking the safety in the chamber, the metallic click grounding me further. Let them drown in their champagne and their fake smiles. Let Arthur Vance pretend he held power. I had a perimeter to secure and a general to protect. I was the invisible shield standing between their pathetic illusions and the harsh reality of the world. And I would do my duty flawlessly, not for them, but for the uniform I wore. The sidearm went back in the holster. I pulled up the next file. Duty did not wait for feelings. If you have ever had to sit in silence while toxic family members paraded their lies and stole your credit, hit the like button right now. Tell me in the comments how you survived their gaslighting, because you are definitely not alone in this fight. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the military encrypted system clock ticked over. The Pentagon's official honors list was published on the Defense Newswire inside the command center. The notification flashed green on my terminal, inside the Aegis banquet hall. It didn't take a global broadcast to shatter the peace. It started with one notification. The CEO of a major defense contracting firm, at table 4, received an alert on his phone. He froze, then shoved the screen toward his business partners. Within seconds, the whisper network of the elite took over. I watched on the security feeds as phones were passed rapidly from hand to hand. The collective buzzing sounded like a swarm of locusts descending upon the marble room. Guests stopped mid-sentence, their champagne glasses halting near their lips as they looked down at their glowing screens. For a terrifying 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. The string quartet kept playing their melody, suddenly absurd, against the frozen faces in the crowd. Then a low, chaotic murmur swept through the crowd as eyes darted from the headlines directly to Richard and Diane. I could see it on the monitors, the ripple, the whisper chain spreading through the room like a crack in a dam, unstoppable and accelerating. A woman in pearls grabbed the arm of the man next to her and pointed at her screen. A hedge fund manager at table 7 turned his phone toward the couple beside him, shaking his head slowly. Guest after guest turned toward my parents, with identical expressions of confused suspicion. The name Reyes was glowing on every screen in the room, and the face attached to it was not the golden child or the patriarch. It was the band daughter, the delusional outcast standing in a pentagon photograph with 3 generals. The perfect family image was cracking in real time, and my parents had not even registered the first fracture yet. Absolute, uncontainable chaos erupted. Arthur Vance looked like he was suffering a massive coronary event. His face drained of all color as he frantically waved his hands, actually trying to physically step in front of guests to block them from looking at their screens, a pathetic futile gesture that only magnified the family's deep guilt. He grabbed the arm of a nearby waiter and whispered something frantic, but the waiter pulled away, staring at his own phone with widened eyes. In the center of the room, Judge Harrison lowered his phone. The judge was a man of strict adherence to integrity. He snorts despised being played for a fool, and he had spent an entire evening shaking the hand of a man who had been lying to his face. He clamped his jaw tight, staring at Richard, with a look of absolute scrutinizing disgust. Harrison instantly saw through the perfect family facade Richard had spent millions to build. Richard tried to step forward to shake the judge's hand, but Harrison deliberately turned his back, a silent, brutal severance of Richard's entire corporate future. The myth of the Reyes family was unraveling in real time, and no amount of champagne could wash the truth off those screens. Victoria Sterling did not miss her golden opportunity to strike. She let out a piercing, mocking laugh that cut sharply through the panicked murmurs. Snorts, she marched forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at Vivien's trembling, horrified face. Well, Vivien, your psycho sister just received a national medal. Victoria announced at full volume, ensuring every single elite guest in the room heard her. Either the government military is crazy or your entire family is the most brazen bunch of frauds I have ever known. The accusation hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Vivien gasped, looking desperately toward Bradley for support. But Bradley's survival instinct kicked in instantly. Recognizing that his wife was now social radioactive waste, he physically stepped 2 large paces away from Vivien, visibly abandoning her to the wolves to save his own Wall Street reputation. His face was a stone mask. He did not even look back at her. In that single calculated side-ep, their marriage was over. The prenup was as good as signed. Vivien stood alone in the center of the most expensive room in the state, surrounded by hundreds of people, and utterly, completely, irreversibly alone. Back in the sterile command room, the heavy blast doors flew open with a bang. Captain Miller rushed in, holding a tablet, his eyes blazing with fierce protective pride. He slammed his hand down on the metal desk, a massive grin breaking through his usual stoicism. Major, the press has reported it. The media network is exploding. Everyone is mentioning your name, and the Aegis Project. He reported, his voice filled with the sheer triumph of a soldier, seeing his commander finally vindicated. The junior analysts in the room paused their typing, beaming with respect. One of them gave me a sharp nod and a quiet, "Congratulations, Major." I slowly shifted my gaze from the chaotic monitor feeds to Miller. I did not cheer, I did not jump up, and I certainly did not smile with petty glee. I simply gave a single slow acknowledging nod. The arrogance of the Reyes family was currently being ground into fine dust by their own lies, and I had not even needed to lift a finger. Truth needs no amplification, it detonates on its own schedule. Miller set the tablet down on my desk, the headlines still glowing. I glanced at it once, then turned back to the monitors. The night was far from over. The desperation of a cornered narcissist knows absolutely no bounds. At 8, through the highly sensitive directional microphones, Miller was monitoring the nightmare reached its absolute peak. In the center of the grand hall, the murmurs died instantly as General Margaret Caldwell marched directly up to Diane. The general's aura, forged by decades of real leadership and command, completely obliterated my mother's fake, fragile elegance. Diane tried to force a welcoming smile, but it trembled pathetically on her lips. Mrs. Reyes, the person who was just nationally honored by the government, is your biological daughter, the general demanded, her voice cracking like a leather whip across the silent room. She is the creator of the fortress you are standing in. So why did you dare to spread rumors to everyone, and even to me, that she is mentally ill? What is the truth? Richard immediately stepped forward, his face slick with sweat, trying to intervene to protect his corporate image. General, there must be a misunderstanding, he stammered, prioritizing damage control over his daughter even now. But Caldwell ignored him entirely, her piercing gaze locked onto Diane, demanding accountability. The general had not survived decades of service by tolerating liars, and she could smell the rot in Diane's rehearsed smile from across the room. Cornered, stripped of her dignity, and exposed in front of hundreds of elites, she had spent her life trying to impress Diane, completely lost her mind. Gasps. Her obsession with flawless, biological perfection shattered like the crystal glasses trembling in the hands around her. She could not handle the truth that her daughter's greatness came from dirt and blood, rather than country clubs and charity galas. She shrieked, her voice tearing through the luxurious silence in a hysterical, ugly pitch, violently pushing Richard away so hard he stumbled sideways into a waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She's a soldier, so she's really crazy, Diane screamed, her face contorted in sheer, desperate malice, mascara starting to streak down her cheeks. She has PTSD, paranoia from killing. She is the shame of this family. She's only good at ruining our perfection. The words echoed off the titanium walls I had built. Every single syllable was a direct insult to the uniform I wore, and the brothers and sisters who served alongside me. General Caldwell's expression hardened into granite. 2 retired military officers near the bar sat down their drinks and stared at Diane with undisguised fury. A colonel's wife physically turned away, her hand pressed flat against her chest, her husband's jaw muscles tightening visibly. In the background, Vivien covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, realizing her mother had just detonated a social catastrophe that would bury them all. She reached for Bradley again, but he had already moved 3 more steps away, putting an entire cluster of guests between them. Patricia clutched her chest, looking like she might faint the weight of the lie, finally crushing her cowardice. Arthur Vance backed into a corner, his hand trembling against his earpiece, completely out of strategies, out of orders to bark, stripped of every ounce of his borrowed authority. The silence that followed Diane's scream was the loudest sound in the room. Hearing those exact words transmitted through my headset, my stoic composure shattered into a million pieces. The air in the command room froze instantly. Miller stopped mid-step. The junior analysts looked up from their screens, their faces draining of color, as they read the shift in my expression. I could endure their personal hatred. I could ignore them treating me like an outcast. I had swallowed their cruelty for years without so much as raising my voice. But the memory flared violently in my mind. The image of my fallen squadmates. The men and women who died in my arms overseas. The ones who actually suffered from the horrors of service, and gave everything so that civilians like Diane could sip champagne and judge people from the safety of a building I designed. I remembered Sergeant Torres, who took shrapnel meant for me, and spent 11 months learning to walk again. I remember Lieutenant Cho, who came home in a flag-draped coffin to a family that was proud of her. Proud, not ashamed, not disgusted, proud for my own mother to weaponize trauma, to desecrate the military uniform, and to spit on the sacrifice of thousands of fallen soldiers just to save her pathetic social standing. That was an unforgivable atrocity. She was not just insulting me. She was insulting the blood of heroes who never came home, the families who hung gold star flags in their windows, the men and women who woke up screaming from nightmares they earned, protecting a nation that included Diane Reyes. The pride of a soldier ignited in my chest, burning away every single ounce of my previous restraint. I was not an arranged daughter anymore. I was a commanding officer witnessing an atrocity against everything I had sworn to protect. I stood up so violently my heavy steel chair crashed backward against the reinforced wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. My eyes locked onto the monitor, radiating pure, freezing intent. The junior analysts flinched, recognizing the terrifying shift from observation to action. I unclipped the headset, letting it drop to the desk. "Miller," I commanded my voice, hammering out like iron, striking an anvil. "Prepare the vehicle. It's time to end this farce." Miller did not ask a single question. He recognized the tone of a commander going into the field. He saluted sharply, his face set in grim determination, and sprinted out the door to prep the armored transport. The time for passively watching the monitors was over. My family had crossed the sacred boundary of military honor, and I was coming home to collect the debt. I stepped into my private quarters and rapidly changed into my pristine dress blue uniform, the heavy fabric rigid with decades of earned authority. The service ribbons caught the fluorescent light. I looked at my reflection in the darkened monitor screen. The woman staring back was not a daughter. She was a reckoning. The roar of my armored military vehicle tore through the silent night headlights, slicing through the dark like twin searchlights. The tires screeched to a halt at the Aegis gates, just past 8. Miller held the door open, and I stepped out, the cool night air hitting the pressed fabric of my dress blue uniform. I walked toward the massive titanium-reinforced oak doors, the very doors I had engineered to withstand devastating force. I knew the weight of each hinge, the gauge of every bolt. I placed both palms flat against the cold surface and shoved them open with a force that sent them swinging wide, crashing against the interior walls with a thunderous boom that silenced the entire hall. I strode into the grand room, towering and absolute in my pristine dress blue uniform, my chest heavy with gleaming service ribbons, each one representing a deployment, a sacrifice, a night spent awake, so that people like these could sleep. The moment I entered, Arthur Vance, desperate to prove his worth to Diane, lunged forward like a loyal guard dog to physically stop me. He planted himself in my path, one hand raised, chin lifted with the absurd authority of a man whose entire career was answering a socialite's phone calls. His inflated sense of importance was laughable. Without breaking stride, I delivered a single firm palm to his chest, a controlled military deflection that halted him cold and sent him stumbling backward onto the polished floor, knocking the wind out of him. He lay there gasping, his earpiece dangling from one ear, the last thread of his imagined power severed. A waiter jumped out of the way. A woman near the entrance dropped her clutch purse. The elite crowd parted. They held their breath in absolute terrified silence, shrinking back from the aura of a decorated officer in full regalia. I did not look at them. I did not acknowledge their expensive gowns or their trembling champagne glasses. I walked through them like they were wallpaper. I walked straight through the sea of wealth, my polished boots echoing on the marble like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. Every step was measured. Every step was earned. I stopped when I stood face to face with my family. Diane stumbled backward, clutching her throat in horror, her eyes wide with the realization of her absolute doom. Her fantasy of biological perfection was dead. The crazy daughter had just walked through the front door, wearing the highest military honors the nation could bestow, standing taller and straighter than anyone in the room. Richard's face was ashen, his jaw locked tight, a vein throbbing visibly at his temple. He was entirely stripped of his corporate power, realizing his money could not buy him a shield against a decorated officer, backed by a 4-star general. His hands hung limp at his sides. He could not even raise them to adjust his tie. General Caldwell stepped forward from the crowd, her 4 stars gleaming under the chandelier. Her eyes were filled with profound respect, completely ignoring my parents as if they were furniture. She did not glance at Diane. She did not acknowledge Richard's existence. She did not ask for their permission, standing right in front of them, close enough that Diane could have reached out and touched her. The general solemnly pinned the Legion of Merit directly onto my chest. The small metallic click of the pin locking into place was the only sound in the room. The gleam of the metal caught the chandelier light and threw it back across the silent faces of every guest who had believed the lie. It was the final undeniable proof that their entire narrative was fiction. The room watched in stunned absolute silence as the most powerful military officer in attendance honored the woman this family had called insane. I stood at attention, my spine straight, my eyes forward, and I felt the weight of the metal settle against my uniform like a verdict handed down from the highest court in the land. I did not scream, I did not raise my voice. I looked down at my mother, my tone echoing with terrifying, freezing clarity. "I am not sick," I stated, burying her gaslighting forever. "The truth is, you feel humiliated because I chose to bleed to protect the country instead of counting money using despicable tricks like you." The psychological fallout was instantaneous. In the corner, Aunt Patricia broke down, sobbing loudly, her cowardly guilt finally breaking her as the elites glared at her complicity. She had spent years standing silently beside my abusers, choosing her trust fund over my dignity. And now every single person in the room could see the price of her kindness written on her face. Beside the ice sculpture, Vivien reached out to grab Bradley's arm for support. But Bradley's survival instinct was ruthless. He shot Vivien a look of pure, unadulterated disgust and physically ripped his arm away, stepping backward into the crowd, abandoning his toxic wife to her ruin. His wedding ring caught the light as he pulled away, and I saw Vivien stare at his retreating back with the hollow, shattered eyes of a woman who had just realized she had nothing left. Snorts. No husband, no allies, no lies to hide behind, just the cold truth and a room full of witnesses. I stepped one pace closer, bypassing Diane entirely and locking eyes with Richard, delivering the final psychological blow to the patriarch. His pupils dilated, his lower lip trembled. The man who had hurled a contract at my chest 6 years ago, who had called me a disgrace, who had threatened to end my career 2 days ago, could not hold my gaze for more than 3 seconds before his eyes dropped to the floor. "I don't need your validation," I commanded, watching the last shred of his ego disintegrate. "You were always afraid I would ruin the face of this family. But the biggest difference between us is, you use money to buy fake honor, while I exist to protect the lives of people like you." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time in his 62 years, the CEO of the Reyes Corporation had absolutely nothing to say. His boardroom tactics, his financial leverage, his network of bought politicians and compliant judges. None of it could save him from the truth spoken by his own daughter in full uniform, with a 4-star general standing behind her. Judge Harrison watched from across the room, arms folded, his verdict already written in the hard line of his mouth. 2 guests near the exit were already typing on their phones. The story was leaving the building before I did. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and actioned louder than any words I could have spoken. I marched back out through the doors. I built my boots, striking the marble in a steady, unhurried rhythm that echoed through the silent hall long after I had disappeared into the night. Miller was waiting by the vehicle, holding the door open. He did not salute. He did not speak. He just nodded one soldier to another and closed the door behind me. The destruction of the Reyes family's facade was absolute and irreversible. They would stand in the wreckage of their own making, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses who would carry the story to every boardroom, country club, and charity gala in the state. Weeks later, the ruins of their lies settled, and the consequences were devastating. I learned the details in fragments, each one arriving through a different channel, each one confirming what I already knew. Their empire was built on sand, and the tide had finally come in. Miller brought me a news alert one morning over coffee, his face grim but unsurprised. Bradley had filed for a ruthless Wall Street divorce the very next morning after the gala, deploying his lawyers to strip Vivien of every asset, citing irreconcilable differences and reputational liability in the filing. He moved out of the penthouse within 48 hours. By the end of the month, Vivien was penniless and isolated, rejected by every charity board she had ever chaired. Victoria Sterling orchestrated Vivien's complete exile from high society, circulating the gala footage to every social circle in the city, turning her into a pariah who could not get a table at a restaurant she used to co-own. A week after that, a junior analyst flagged a financial report on my terminal. Judge Harrison had severed all government ties with Richard, sending the Reyes Corporation's stock into a terminal nosedive. 3 federal contracts were pulled. 2 board members resigned, publicly issuing statements that specifically referenced concerns about corporate leadership integrity. Arthur Vance was fired without severance, escorted off the property by the new security company Richard was forced to hire after my unit pulled our perimeter support. He left carrying a box of personal items and the shattered remnants of his inflated ego. Diane, entirely broken by the public humiliation and the destruction of her flawless image, locked herself in her bedroom, finally descending into the true isolation she had so viciously accused me of suffering from. The woman who called me delusional was now the one refusing to leave her room, refusing phone calls, refusing visitors, unable to face the society she had spent her entire life trying to impress. One afternoon, as I stood by the armory checking inventory logs, my phone screen lit up. A text message from Richard. It was a pathetic, graveling paragraph begging for a meeting to make peace and rebuild our father-daughter bond. He had typed it himself. I could tell because the grammar was stiff and the punctuation was perfect, the unmistakable syntax of a man who dictated memos for a living. I read the words slowly, one by one, recognizing the psychological pattern instantly. It was not love. It was a desperate CEO trying to leverage my new national prestige to save his dying company and plummeting stock. He did not miss me. He missed what my name could do for his balance sheet. He wanted a photo of us together, Major and CEO, father and decorated daughter, something he could leak to the financial press to stop the hemorrhaging. Even after everything, after the banishment, after the lies, after calling me a disgrace, after threatening to end my career, he still only saw me as a financial asset. The words, "I'm sorry," appeared nowhere in the message. He did not mention the gaslighting, the PTSD lies, or the Christmas Eve humiliation. Instead, there were phrases like strategic partnership and family legacy and mutual benefit. He could not even beg without sounding like a quarterly earnings call. My thumb hovered over the screen for exactly 1 second. I read the hollow words without a single flutter in my chest. I did not type a furious reply. I did not demand a heartfelt apology, because you cannot extract blood from a stone. With a single decisive tap of my thumb, I deleted the message and blocked the number permanently. They were ghosts to me now, completely exorcised from my reality. I slipped the phone back into my tactical vest pocket, leaving the weakness of the Reyes bloodline behind forever. The deletion took less than a second. The liberation lasted a lifetime. I turned back to the inventory logs, marking off the next item on the list with the same steady hand that had once built the installation my family tried to claim as their own. There was work to do. There was always work to do. I stood on the dusty training grounds, the setting sun painting the barren sky in strokes of violent, beautiful red. The dry wind blew grit against my face, and I let it. It felt real. It felt earned. Beside me, Captain Miller barked sharp orders to a fresh squad of military engineers. A young private fumbled with a wrench, dropped it, picked it up, tried again. Miller corrected her grip without raising his voice. The sweat hit the dirt. The commands echoed with real purpose, and the steel frames of a new project rose slowly from the ground under their hands. I watched the young cadets move with discipline and honor my true chosen family. They did not care about my last name or my father's stock portfolio. They did not care about designer gowns or charity galas or country club memberships. They cared about whether I could lead them, teach them, protect them, and I could. I had proven it with steel and sweat and scars that I wore without shame. A cadet looked up at me, uncertain, seeking approval. I gave her a single firm nod, the same nod Miller had given me years ago over a wrench at Fort Aegis. The same nod that said, "You belong here." I looked out toward the horizon, my eyes free and at absolute peace. True power does not come from toxic manipulation or bitter revenge. It comes from the courage to stand by your truth, even when the people who were supposed to love you are the ones trying to bury it. My silence was not a weakness. It was the unbreakable legacy of the strong. Miller glanced over at me, a quiet nod passing between us. No words necessary. We had a new squad to train, a new generation to shape, and a new day beginning on the horizon. I took a deep breath of the dry, gritty wind and turned back to the work. There was always more to build. If my journey showed you that walking away from a toxic family is a sign of immense strength, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below, sharing the hardest boundary you ever had to set, because your story might just be the survival guide someone else desperately needs.